it was in our college junior year, I believe it was, in college, and I wanted to have a pre-law minor, so I needed to take an ethics course, but we didn't have any. So this professor, Leslie Church, decided to create this course for me during the month of January because we had these interims in between the semesters. Well, you could do this, but you can go to the state capitol and you can study as a legislative research intern. Oh, that's cool. So she helped make the arrangements on this whole thing all the time to go and draw up the course outline and what I would do and how I would go. And I get up there and think, where would I stay? Well, there's some places. Here's one here that you might want to reach out for and ask if you could stay there and work that out with him. So I drive up, not knowing who or what or where. I drive up to this little bitty house. It's kind of a nice little house, right? Oh, it was several blocks from the state capitol in the city. And I pull up and meet this guy named John Anderson. He's a cowboy that had retired from the ranch and moved into the city, and he had a dog. His little dog was like a shepherd, like a little black and white shepherd, about the size of a blue heeler. And said, well, yeah, you can stay up here. I got an extra room. And he had a little bedroom in the corner, and we looked at it and like, oh, okay, well, this will work. Close enough to the Capitol. I can make all this work. And I had a a four-door Ford Galaxy 500 car. I mean, the heater didn't work. I had to have a blanket on to drive in the cold to get there. I mean, the whole story, uphill both ways. And that was honestly true, because it was cold going up there during about 150 miles or so from Mitchell, had to drive. So I'd get up there, and how much to stay? He said, well, he said, how does $20 a week sound? Well, I thought, oh, I can handle that. So I packed up my food, like, what am I going to eat for the week? And, how do you handle this? Where are you going to cook? So I fill up the car with different grocery things I thought would last. And I got up there and oh, no. He said, I cook breakfast in the morning and I cook supper at night and I make coffee. And he said, you could just join me for breakfast and you can join me for supper. Oh, well, that was nice. So I got there, he cleaned the room all up and he had a little light on in the corner on the nightstand, like so welcoming and warm. And so I went in and I got my stuff ready to go for class or the research. And I'd get up in the morning. Well, he says it's breakfast time, and he'd get up and he'd make breakfast. I mean, he might make eggs and bacon, or he might make oatmeal or grits. I mean, he just did his own thing. And making coffee was really the treat. That was the focal point. He had one of these old Blue Trail coffee pots, had a lot of fire stains on it. That thing has seen some action out in the field and the prairies. I know it has. So he'd go to make coffee, he'd be boiling the water, and when you'd come down or come around the corner there into his little kitchen, little table for two, and it was a tiny little cozy space, and come out and he said, well, let me get some coffee going. So he dumped the grounds, not in the strainer, but right into the top of this thing. And then he'd watch it. He'd sit, he'd stare at it while he's talking. Yeah. He'd stare at that pot like this with a little glass partially full of water. He'd watch, and pretty soon the coffee grounds would start to boil, and they'd burst right up out of there if you didn't do anything. Well, he'd shock it with a little cold water when it started to look like it was going to come out the top. He'd shock it with a little water. He'd watch. Then he'd shock it with a little water. And pretty soon he said, okay, coffee will be ready in a little bit. Evidently, shocking it like that kept it from boiling over. And then after a couple of times, then it would just sit there and percolate and just bubble without bursting out of the pot. And it's true, because I tried it later and I didn't shock it, and it was a big mess. So he was absolutely right about that. No question. So he'd have coffee. So we'd have breakfast, and he'd sit down. He made breakfast and offered to buy groceries and stuff. He did not. He just wanted to talk. What are you going to do today, or who are you going to work with? And the fellowship was wonderful, wonderful. And then he'd pour that coffee in, and you look in there like this, and you think, There's almost breakfast in that coffee cup right there. It's just like a bunch of crunchy little nuts and beans in there, but it was really good. I really liked it. And I thought, man, I like this. And you get down towards the end, you just about need to get a spoon to get the rest of your coffee up out of there. And that was okay. I just loved it, the time we spent together. And so it was really cold in the morning. I thought, oh, I wonder if my car is going to start. Geez, that Galaxy was cold. And I didn't realize it, but some of those cars had these heaters. They would put a little heater in the circulation system, and you could plug that little heater in, and it would just heat up the antifreeze and let it circulate through the block of the motor, so it could make it warm enough to start when it was super cold. Well, I went out and I saw this drop cord running across this snowbank in the yard out to the front of my car. I thought, ooh, wonder what that's about. Oh, maybe my battery's dead. I didn't know. I walk out there and he followed me out, with his cap on. He had his hat on, never put his coat on too often, but he followed me out and said, well, he said, it looked like it was going to be cold this morning. So he said, I thought I'd plug your car in so it'd be nice and warm when you got ready to go into this here Capitol thing and do what you got to do. I said, oh, that was sweet. It started up and it was warm. I mean, it was wonderful. He'd wrap up the cord and take care of it. I'd go about my day and I'd come back, and for supper, he might have flat steak or chicken fried steak or stew. He made the things that he made, and so we'd have dinner and talk. It was so much fun to talk with him. He would and then he would buy a little steak for his dog, a little thin, kind of a flat steak. And every night we get done with supper, we'd go in the other room and he'd sit on the sofa and I had that little chair across, and we sat there and visit some more. And his dog would come up in there and he'd have a plate, the steak. So he'd cut the steak off into little bitty pieces while we were talking, and he'd feed his dog. So he fed his dog that steak while we were talking in the evening. That was his dog's supper. And it was just so cool. Well-mannered, well-behaved dog, just was amazing. And every day, and it just all this conversation during this time, and it was just an amazing adventure. And we'd talk about what we'd cover in the legal system, or what I did, or what the laws were, and that sort of thing. And one evening, this was like a whole month long, every day. And one evening we were talking, and I was studying fungi. In the next semester, I was going to go into a second phase of plant morphology and study fungus. So I said, yeah. He said, what are you doing in college when you get back? I said, well, I'm going to study fungus. We're going to try to isolate a fungus so that we could digest cotton balls into sugar. So we think we got one called Trichoderma ricei. What's the name of the fungus? He said, really? It has a name like that? I said, oh, this name is one of the simpler ones. I said, some of those names could be just outrageous. I said, and I don't know who put those names together, but they're just really. He said, where do they grow? How do they live? Well, they live like, for example, in a garden, they live on a pumpkin, or they live on a squash, or the side of a tree, and we got to have some conversation about that. I said, I was just doing research to try to isolate the fungus that I wanted to study when I got back in college. So I was reading about it. I had some books, and legislator, you're sitting there, you got a lot of time waiting until you have to be doing something. So I would read in the chambers. Well, one night I came back after the day and went back into my room, and there were several pumpkins in my room. Couple, three sitting here, a squash, I don't know, whatever it was. He went down in his cellar and he found that fungus was growing on the side of his pumpkins and squash. He thought that'd be helpful for my research. So he brought them up and he put them in my room and he set them along the wall. He said, well, I thought you might want to do a little extra research here. I got these, and maybe I'd like to know what they are and what I should do about them. And so I got the book and we'd look, yeah, this one's green. It has the little flowers, or it has this. And we sat in my room. We sat on the floor in there, and we just looked at this stuff. And he said, I'd seen that for years, but I just threw it away because I didn't know what it was or whether I should eat it or not. And then I had some books. I got one to the library there so I could keep books and things. And he would look at the pictures. And when I'd go during the day, I knew he was in there looking at that stuff because it was just a new world for him. But, for $20 a week, our friendship and fellowship, all during that time, was an amazing gift for me. I studied a lot in the research. Uh, I worked for Lars Herseth. He happened to be the House Minority Leader at the time on the Democratic Party. And then I did research on they were going to do, at the time, there was a law that was trying to define death, like quality of life, or when death was, or that kind of thing. So I was researching that, and later it would come to be that I would write a paper on that for my ethics class. I didn't realize, but it just kind of was a stage for that. And we were studying that. But I tell you, the morning coffees with him and the evening visits, I think about if I were him, what gift that would be to me and what he meant to me and taught me how that maybe I can share that with somebody sometime. And it was a wonderful, that experience was, and I went back and into the college after the semester was over, turned in my paper, my summary, and part of the curriculum that we developed. And I said, boy, I was lucky to really get this guy. Man, this was kind of well, probably not realizing that it could have been her great uncle or who knows what the connection was. But she knew, the professor who helped me set that up, she knew what all this would be for me and what it meant. And I told her too at the end, in my write-ups, that that was such a wonderful experience. And so it was what a great help. I mean, what a great boost for me. It was incredible. I look